I'm happy to open the first session of today. My name is Professor Solih Shahvar from the University of Haifa, Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. Today, on this session, we have two distinguished speakers. The first one would be Professor Mikhail Shenkar, who is Associate Professor of Pre-Islamic Iranian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who specializes in the study of civilization and cultures of the pre-Islamic Iranian world through their material remains and visual representations. His research interests encompasses the archaeology, art, and religions of pre-Islamic Iran and Central Asia, including Zoroastrianism, with a particular focus on religious iconography, the culture of the Eurasian nomads, the Sogdian civilization, and the Silk Road. Professor Shenkar is currently director, together with Dr. Sharof Kurbanov, I hope I said it right, of the Tajik Academy of Sciences, of the excavations at the Sogdian town of Sanjar Shah in northern Tajikistan. Today, the talk of the Professor Shenkar is the Achaemenid Dynasty, Zoroastrianism, and the origins of the fire temples. Professor Shenkar, please.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? Right. Thank you very much, Professor Shahvar, for this kind introduction. I would like to thank God and the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm very glad that my teacher, Professor Shaul Shaked, is honored also here in Haifa, the city where he grew up, and I was especially excited to learn yesterday that this building where we are currently sitting is actually part of the Riali school where Shaul Shaked studied as a pupil, and here he met two of his most influential teachers, Yosef Schechter and Meir Kister, and the communication with them influenced his entire career and determined it to the certain extent. So it's very touching to be here in this Riali school where it all began for Professor Shaked, at least in terms of his scientific career, so to say. Okay, today I take this opportunity to go for myself a little bit back to the Achaemenid period and to share with you some thoughts on the religion of the dynasty and the origin of the fire temples. So since antiquity, Zoroastrianism is almost synonymous with fire worship. There is solid evidence that the Zoroastrian veneration of fire goes back to the Indo-European unity, as can be seen from the Roman cult of Vesta and her sacred fire. That works. Ritual fire occupied a prominent place in the Indo-Iranian religion and Celtic practices, as evident from the Vedic cult, which is also focused on fire. Two of the basic and most emblematic features of the Zoroastrian cult today is that it is centered on the eternal fire, which is kept constantly burning by priests in a special room within a closed building called Atashkade, Dare Mehr, or Agyari in Gujarati for the Indian Zoroastrians. I'm showing you some pictures of modern fire temples. This one is from Iran. and this one is from India, from Mumbai, yeah, and inside the fire temple in India. However, this practice can be confidently traced back only to the Sasanian period. In general, establishing the time and context of the appearance of these features has been one of the major difficulties in the history of Zoroastrianism. The goal of my paper today is to revisit this question in light of the results of the recent excavations in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, with a special focus on the Achaemenid period. The reign of the Achaemenid dynasty was probably the second formative period in the development of Zoroastrianism. Scholars rightly attributed crucial importance to this era, and much ink has been spilled on the exhaustive and often abstract and repetitive debates over the religion of the Achaemenid kings, or more specifically, how the evidence that we possess for the religious practices and worldview of the Achaemenids corresponds or contradicts the tenets of Zoroastrianism as they are known from the texts codified as late as the Abbasid period. I just put here perhaps the most recent and comprehensive contribution, this volume edited by Wouter Henkelmann and Céline Redard is dedicated to this question. However, the same scholars seldom took care to define what exactly do we mean by the term Zoroastrianism in the second half of the first millennium BCE. I'm convinced that such a definition must precede any discussion of pre-Sasanian Iranian religious material. Only at the second stage should the material in question be analyzed and compared with that definition. Now, there is a growing agreement among scholars that the presence of the liturgy in the Avestan language should be considered the defining characteristic of Zoroastrianism. The second essential criterion, in my opinion, is the position of Ahura Mazda, the specifically Zoroastrian god, as the highest and the most prominent creator deity. The presence of this second criterion in the Achaemenid royal inscriptions is undeniable, although it is also clear that Ahura Mazda was, first of all, the patron god of the Achaemenid dynasty, less popular even in Pars itself, and perhaps introduced by the Achaemenids from the east only by Darius or shortly before his accession. The first condition is notoriously more difficult to pinpoint due to a simple and well-known fact that the Avestan language and the Zoroastrian liturgy were committed to writing only many centuries after the Achaemenid period. Attempts were made to demonstrate that some formulae from the Achaemenid royal inscriptions and names of a few members of the Achaemenid family can be considered as a sort of Avestan quotations that thus reveal the presence of the Avestan liturgy in the Achaemenid court. However, as noted by Alberto Cantera, most of these citat namen correspond to the formulae found also in the Rig Veda. Yeah, I refer you here first of all to this contribution by Alberto. Thus, rather than necessarily being taken from the Avestan compositions, they might reflect common Indo-Iranian background. There is one piece of evidence, however, that does reveal the existence of Avestan liturgy linked with the Achaemenid royal dynasty. This is a Zoroastrian calendar whose earliest attestation appears in the Aramaic documents from the archive of the Achaemenid satrap of Bactria, published by Shaul Shaked, whose memory we honor today, with Yosef Naveh. This calendar was introduced by the Achaemenids after the conquest of Egypt. Unlike the Old Persian or the Babylonian calendar, it was a liturgical calendar developed exclusively for ritual purposes. Summing up this brief discussion, I do think that the Achaemenids were Zoroastrians, although we should not, of course, expect them to conform to the doctrines developed in the Sasanian and even in the early Muslim period. Just like the early Christians perceived and practiced their religion very differently from their descendants in medieval Europe. We must also be cautious not to project all the notions from the Zoroastrian texts back to the Achaemenid period and to impose them on the Achaemenid inscriptions, which are non-religious in nature. With these observations in mind, let us go back to the cult of fire. Too often, every building in the Iranian world with evidence of non-functional usage of fire is described as a fire temple. However, just like with Zoroastrianism, we should first agree on what we mean by this term fire temple. In my understanding, a fire temple is a closed structure which houses a sacred, constantly sustained fire, and this is the exclusive purpose of this building. The fire itself serves as the focus of rituals that take place in the building itself. In this sense, the most important archaeological evidence for the fire temple is carefully deposited and preserved layers of pure ashes. It is worth noting that the practice of attributing a sacredness to the ashes and taking special care to store pure ashes is attested already for the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex or Bronze Age Oxus civilization of Central Asia, which was most probably not in the Iranian. Therefore, the attestation of this custom by itself in Central Asia, Bronze and Iron Age site, is not necessarily evidence of Zoroastrianism. The Indo-Iranians in general and the people who composed the old Avestan texts at the end of the second or at the beginning of the first millennium BCE in particular had no special closed structures for worship and venerated their gods focusing on the sacred fire under the open skies. For a long period, the earliest closed temple associated with the Iranians, or most specifically with the Medes, was Tepe Nush-i Jan, excavated in western Iran. I show you the plan of Tepe Nush-i Jan. Here you can see the plan of the site, and I don't know if it works. Yeah, and here you see the so-called central temple and the reconstruction of the facade. Yeah. Here you can see the pictures of the site, very well preserved. The plan of the temple. Dated around 700 BCE and situated in western Iran, it has a cross-shaped layout and almost perfect axial symmetry. A mud brick altar was built in the western part of the main room and separated by a low wall. Yeah, here you can see it on the plan. Here are the pictures of the mud brick altar. The altar is 85 centimeters high and square at the top, measuring 1.41 centimeters. On the top, it has a small depression, 23 centimeters in diameter and 7.5 centimeters deep, with traces of intense burning. Yeah. Here you can see the altar with this depression. And more closely. It is clear that this depression was not deep enough to sustain a permanently burning fire, and no layers of pure ashes were uncovered in the temple. However, it is also clear that the veneration of fire played a central role in this building, and the shape of the Tepe Nush-i Jan altar, this particular stepped shape, was continued in the Achaemenid period. The famous reliefs of the Achaemenid tombs at Naqsh-e-Rostam and the testimony of classical authors leave no doubts that the Persian kings worshipped fire. Moreover, also the images from the Persepolis archive, which show veneration of fire placed on an altar indicate that as early as the reign of Darius, also wider circles of courtiers in Parsa participated in the fire worship. Yeah, you can see seal impressions from the Persepolis archive depicting veneration of fire. Yeah. Note the shape of this altar, which clearly continues the shape that we've seen at Tepe Nush-i Jan. The questions are, where did they do it? Was it an eternal fire, and where was it kept? The answer to the first question does not appear particularly difficult. Like their Indo-Iranian ancestors, the Achaemenids conducted their fire rituals under the open sky, on high places or at least on the artificial platform and podiums like those in the so-called sacred precinct at Pasargade. Right, here you can see the Pasargade. The Achaemenid monumental iconography depicts only the king in interaction with the fire altar and the representation of Ahura Mazda, but in reality the main rituals around the fire must have been conducted by priests. This picture again. It is much more challenging to understand if the fire depicted on the reliefs of the royal tombs or on the ceilings from Persepolis is an eternal fire in accordance with the later Zoroastrian practice or not. Simple logic suggests that the constantly sustained fire must be sheltered from the elements, and indeed from the Sasanian period until today, it is kept in a special small room called Atoshgah. In other words, if the Achaemenids had an eternal fire, it must have been kept in some building. But such structures were not identified in the Achaemenid centers in western Iran, and no closed temples have been uncovered there. The tradition of closed temples to which Nush-i Jan apparently belonged was not practiced by the Achaemenids. I think that the recent reconstruction of the fire rituals in the Avesta by Götz König and Alberto Cantera gives us some clues. According to them, the fire was kept in the houses of men, constantly burning and receiving offerings twice a day. For the sacrifice, it was brought to the special open air ritual area, and at the end of the sacrifice, the fire was returned to the same houses of men. Some rituals were eventually performed in these houses of men themselves. Thus, König and Cantera postulate the existence of the constantly sustained fire already for the Avestan community. These houses can be priestly houses, but more likely perhaps those of the Dahupati, the lord of the country, thus establishing a link between the ritual and eternal fire and the fire of a ruler. The Achaemenid royal cult might have been similar. The fire was kept at some place associated with the royal palace, was taken outside to an open-air sacrificial area for the ritual performance and then brought back. Such structure or structures, which admittedly are yet to be identified archaeologically, might be in fact depicted as the so-called tower-like structures on the Persepolis ceilings and on the coins of the Frataraka rulers of Pars as late as the Hellenistic period. Now, in the Persepolis archive, in addition to fire altars, we also have these enigmatic structures which always appear also in very clear ritual context. Here you see. They're always depicted in ritual context, people bringing offerings, and the fire altar is placed before them, and the animals are brought, obviously, for being sacrificed, and very similar structure we continue to see on the coins of rulers of Pars in the Hellenistic period. Luckily, there is also a written source from which we can infer that the practice of keeping the fire burning for a long period of time existed among the Achaemenids. In the following passage of Diodorus Siculus regarding the funeral of Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, Diodorus describes the following. I will read it for you. As part of the preparations for the funeral, the king ordered the cities of the region to contribute to its splendor in accordance with their ability, and he proclaimed to all the people of Asia that they should sedulously quench what the Persians call the sacred fire, until such time as the funeral should be ended. This was the custom of the Persians when their kings died, and people thought that the order was an ill omen and the heaven was foretelling the king's own death. What is important for us here is that the fire described by Diodorus is a royal fire linked with kingship. This connection is reaffirmed by Isidore of Charax for the Parthian period, when he describes the ever-burning fire of Arshak, the founder of the Arshakid dynasty, burning in the city of Asak. Yeah, here you can see the relevant passage. As late as the Sasanian period, the inscriptions on the reverse of the coins of the first Sasanian king identifies the flame mounted on the throne altar, depicted there as the fire of Ardashir, as you can see here, Adure Ardashir. It's not some abstract fire, but a specific fire of the king, specific king. Our chronological anchor for the existence of closed temples not related to the royal court, where the sacred fire was kept constantly burning, is the geographical Strabo, completed at the beginning of the 1st century CE. Strabo describes numerous fire temples of the Magi in Cappadocia, in Asia Minor. However, it remains uncertain where this is the legacy of the Achaemenid period in Asia Minor or subsequent local development influenced by the Greek cultic practices. The Central Asian material is especially important here since the people who composed the Avestan texts lived in Central Asia. Indeed, we find that in Sogdiana and Bactria, during the 1st millennium BCE, rites were performed under the open sky on mud brick terraces like those found at the sites of Pachmak Tepe and Pshak Tepe. This practice continues in Central Asia in the Achaemenid period at Kok Tepe and Sangir Tepe, and is attested as late as the Hellenistic period at Ai-Khanum. In recent years, however, several important discoveries were made in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan that, according to some scholars, represent the first examples of the fire temples. The earliest of these buildings is the site of Topaz Kala in southern Turkmenistan, excavated by Polish archaeologists and dated to the 10th, 8th century BCE. It consists of 4 rooms, a larger one being almost square. Its roof was supported by 3 columns arranged in a line. The round clay podium, 1 meter approximately in diameter, was erected in the western part of the main room, close to the central axis. It was probably aligned with the entrance, which must have been located in the western wall, allowing a direct line on the podium. This podium, interpreted by the excavators as a fire altar, bears traces of intense burning. It was surrounded by a low square enclosure. Oh, you can see it here. Most importantly, a storage jar was dug into a floor in the southwestern corner of the room that contained ashes. This indicates that the cultic significance was attributed to the ashes, which corresponds to their importance in the Zoroastrian fire temples. However, the excavators detected clear signs that hot ashes were cooled with water. Such treatment of ashes is, of course, abhorrent to the Zoroastrian practice. Another site is Sangir Tepe, situated in the Kashkadaria region of modern Uzbekistan. This site I know better since I participated in its excavations than I was a student. According to the excavators, the closed temple existed here before the arrival of the Achaemenids. It was situated outside the fortified area of the city, and its dimensions are 34 on 40 meters. The building has two wings attached to a central cellar with two entrances. The Achaemenid remains are indicated in dark. What you see also on the plan are the remains of the circular fortress from the 4th century CE, there later. The roof of the cellar was supported by 4 wooden columns. The fireplace that is interpreted as a fire altar by the excavations is not situated in the middle of the cellar, but is deliberately moved west and aligned on the axis with the southern entrance. Yeah, you can see here foyer hotel, the fire altar, deliberately aligned with the entrance. Moreover, also the walls of the eastern passage are not straight, apparently on purpose, allowing the direct view on the fireplace. Yeah, you see here, they are not straight, but they are made in order to allow a direct view on the fire altar. This contradicts the practice of the modern atashga, the fire chamber in the fire temple, which must be kept hidden from the view. The alleged fire altar is in fact no more than a conic earth elevation erected on the foundation of pebbles. If this fireplace was the focus of the cult in this building, one has to ask, why is it so unpretentious? While much efforts and resources were invested in the construction of the building itself. The cultic function of the building is suggested by the evidence of the foundation ritual and an unusual burial associated with the structure. However, it is also possible that the foundation ritual simply designates this building as a public structure, not necessarily a sanctuary, and that from the point of view of Zoroastrian doctrine, the connection between the burial and the sacred area would be unacceptable. In the Achaemenid period, this building was replaced by a platform which was also associated with fireplaces and 2 fragments of human skulls. The platform finally went out of use in the 3rd century BCE. In sum, the location of this structure outside the settlement walls, the foundation rituals, and the subsequent cultic platform indicate that this building at Sangir Tepe was perhaps indeed a kind of sanctuary. Fire might have played a role in the rituals, but it was not a fire temple, and any connection with subsequent Zoroastrian fire temples is unclear. One of the most interesting monuments is certainly Kindik Tepe, located in the Surkhan Darya Valley in southern Uzbekistan. It is dated to the 4th century BCE. The main room has a rectangular plan and 4 asymmetrically placed columns. The installations, which are interpreted as fire altars, were made of clay and have almost completely disappeared. Here you can see on the reconstruction, but really nothing can be there indicated here. The installations and the ashes that I will mention, but not much can be seen in the actual record. These installations are reconstructed mainly based on the traces of intense burning. Here, layers of ashes were identified in the same room, but they are only 10 centimeters thick, which seems to rule out the possibility that they originate in the permanently sustained fire that burned there for a long time. The ceramic assemblage is rather ordinary, and there are no cultic or unusual vessels or any objects that can be interpreted as offerings. The most important feature that does suggest a ritual function is its plan, restricting access to the main hall and limiting the possibility to see the fire. You can see it very clearly, and it's very different from what we saw at Sangir Tepe. Here, this corridor clearly restricts the accessibility to the main room and the ability, and it's impossible to have a direct view on the fire. Another possible sanctuary from the Achaemenid period recently excavated in the Surkhandarya region of Uzbekistan is Kizil Tepe. Here the building was erected on the highest point of the citadel of a large city, and the plan is different, essentially being a cella surrounded by a corridor. Yeah, the citadel is here. Here is the plan of the late period. Two mud brick installations identified as fire altars were excavated in the temple. Here you can see them marked in red. They have small depressions on the top filled with ashes. Layers of ashes were also found in the cella, but they're only 1 centimeter thick. Here you can see the view of Kizil Tepe, and here's the view on one of these installations with this round depression with traces of burning. Finally, there is a site of Cheshmi Shafa, located to the south of Bactra in northern Afghanistan. A monumental stone altar was discovered here by the French archaeological mission, but it is not clear whether it was in the context of a closed building or not. They were not able to finish the excavations because of the conditions in Afghanistan. It was not safe. It rather seems that this altar stood in the open courtyard. This fact, as well as its shape, material, and dimensions, suggest a connection with the royal Achaemenid cult rather than with local traditions. Yeah, you can clearly see the dimensions of these monumental altars. In this aspect, Cheshmi Shafa is clearly different from the above-mentioned examples. The altar is more than 2 meters high, and there can be no doubt that such a monumental installation was part of a publicly celebrated cult. The round depression on its surface appears too small for a constantly burning fire. It is possible that fire was brought here, perhaps in the metallic vessels like the modern practice, and installed on the altar for public worship. So how do these discoveries contribute to our understanding of the genesis of the Zoroastrian fire temples? There can be little doubt that fire played an important, perhaps a central role in the cult of these structures. The evidence for the constantly sustained fire and for the rituals that took place there is, however, limited. We must remember that such practices were not unique to Zoroastrianism, but were probably common to all Indo-Iranians and even to some Indo-European people, such as Greeks and Romans. The plan of Sangir Tepe and Kindik Tepe buildings is perhaps relevant to the tetra-style Bactrian temples of the later Hellenistic period, such as, for example, Takhti Sangin, because one of the main features of the later temples in Bactria is this tetra-style cella. So it's possible there is some continuation from the Achaemenid period. But this link remains to be explored. Be that as it may, these closed sanctuaries, if this is indeed what they are, had no influence on the Achaemenid cult and were not adopted by them. We should not underestimate the fact that special cultic significance was attributed also to the fireplaces of important public buildings and houses of rulers and leaders. In the Greek world, for example, the fireplace was the political center of the community, taking the place of what originally was the hearth of the king. And this practice goes back to the Mycenaean Megarons, whose tetra-style cella is remarkably close to what we see in Central Asia. I think that some of these buildings in Uzbekistan from the pre-Achaemenid and Achaemenid Central Asia might have been such communal or political centers. In some of them, perhaps fire was kept constantly burning. Other communities had different traditions. These practices were shared by many Indo-Iranian as perhaps even non-Indo-Iranian communities. After the Iranian migration to the Iranian plateau, they brought these varieties of fire worship with them. The earliest evidence for this is found among the Medes at Tepe Nush-i Jan. At least from the times of Darius, some Persians also venerated fire. This fire was a royal fire, kept constantly burning in some unknown place, probably related to the palace complexes. The Achaemenids promoted the Avestan liturgy and the fire worship, in other words, Zoroastrianism, and spread it among the Aryan, that means Iranian people, since this cult was probably considered by them to be an Aryan and not only a Persian cult. It seems that only after the Macedonian conquest that the tradition of closed temples that also housed the main rituals and ceremonies instead of temporal removal of the fire to an open area evolved in the Iranian world. But the association with kingship was maintained. Admittedly, we still lack excavated pre-Sasanian fire temples. But based on textual sources, the appearance of fire temples should be attributed to the Parthian period at the latest. Perhaps, and this is my speculation, they first evolved among the Iranian diaspora in Asia Minor, who lived under non-Iranian kings. And this is why the fire cult was disassociated from kingship, like we read in the testimony on Strabo. In the Sasanian period, numerous fire temples were established in Pars, dedicated to individual gods or members of the royal family. While in Iran, the importance of the fire temples for the Zoroastrian community had decreased dramatically in the 20th century, in India, there are still central institutions of the Parsi cult where priests still keep the everlasting fire of their religion, just as their ancestors did for centuries. I show you the picture of future priests in Kama Institute. So thank you very much.
Professor Shenkar for illuminating lecture. And Gad?
Well, thank you for a very instructive and informative lecture. I think you've told us many things that we did not know. And I think I'm speaking not only for myself. Sometimes I had a difficulty following you because there was a lot of material, of course. Now, what I understand, and I just want to check this, is so among the Achaemenids, there was a form of fire worship.
Certainly.
A form of fire worship. But what I gathered from your presentation was that this fire worship was very much associated with the figure of the king. Is that right?
Well, it seems so from the written sources and from the iconography, which would obviously be very strange for the Avestan cult of fire. There are no kings in the Avesta, and in general, we see in the iconography what is strange from the point of view of someone who studies, for example, Avestan liturgy, is that king is always shown in interaction with the fire altar. He's not supposed to do it. The one who is supposed to do it is a priest, the ritual specialist. The king is only supposed to serve as a patron of this ritual performance, right, to support it. And this is probably Mesopotamian influence, like indeed the association between the king and the personal god of the king, which is also a non-Iranian feature. Certainly borrowed from Mesopotamia.
I was making the association with Mesopotamia indeed, which
For sure.
I know better than the Persian realities, where it is indeed the burning hearth or the burning fire of the fireplace of the family is to be kept burning at all times, and it is a symbol of the continuity of that family. So I was wondering whether there was this dynastic idea behind this fire worship among the Achaemenids.
You mean that this feature existed also in Mesopotamia?
This is a feature that certainly existed in Mesopotamia. That was the meaning of this veneration of the fireplace in a domestic context, but could be also found in the palace, of course, because that also is a family context, but
Sure.
a dynastic context. So I was wondering whether there is some similarity there with the Achaemenid practice, whether that fire would somehow symbolize the continuity of the dynasty.
Well, what the evidence suggests is that it's the personal fire of the king, which is extinguished, or as the Zoroastrians would say, is killed, then the king dies. And also when we have later sources, then the fire is always personal. It's never called the fire of the house of Sasan, for example. It's the fire of Ardashir, or it's established for the soul of someone. So it was probably related to the persona of the king. This is what the very limited evidence tells us.
May I? So thank you very much also from me for your very instructing lecture. And I was especially grateful because you started with a methodological note to say we first have to actually define what is Zoroastrian in order to ask whether or not the Achaemenids were Zoroastrians. And I think this is a very good way to do it. So I have two questions actually for the calendar. Is the calendar a local thing in Bactria, or was it for the whole empire? As far as I know, in the west of the empire, they used other calendars. So is this really a sign that they were convinced this is our calendar, or did they just adopt a local calendar there? And the second thing with the fire, as far as I understand you, this is a widespread Indo-European thing with the fire. And it is in families, it is with kings, and this and that and that. And as far as I understand you, what we find for the Achaemenids is not really fitting the Western liturgy, which I don't know. So you have to say that. And therefore, I don't see your final conclusion then to say this is a widespread thing, a general thing, in many, many forms, but then is it or is it not a sign for attesting the Achaemenids being Zoroastrians? I'm not against it, it's fine, but I just want to understand it because I think this is a short conclusion.
First question. Actually, we're very lucky because the best specialist on the Iranian calendars who's written extensively on this subject is actually in this room today with us, Professor Antonio Panaino, so he can later say much more about the Iranian calendar. But just briefly address your question. Certainly other calendars were used, and also in the Bactrian documents we see that they also use the Babylonian calendar. But later in the Hellenistic period we see, and in the later periods, we see that this Western calendar is attested also in, the Cappadocian calendar is more or less like the Sogdian calendar on the other side of the empire. They are all based basically on the Western calendar, and this can only be explained by this imperial dissimulation of the calendar, but only among the Iranian people. Where there are no Iranian people, so this is why we only have it in Asia Minor and then in the East.
But
so
it's later.
It's later, but it's certainly, how can you explain the existence of the same calendar in Cappadocia and in Sogdiana if it's not by the Achaemenid administration, I don't know. But Professor Panaino will certainly have much more to say about the calendar later if we have time. And regarding the fire cult and Zoroastrianism, this is why, of course, your comment is correct, but this is why in my definition of Zoroastrianism, I deliberately left the fire cult out. I mentioned two criterions, the existence of the Avestan liturgy and the position of Ahura Mazda as the primary creator god. You're absolutely right that the fire cult is common to many Indo-European people and even constantly sustained fire, as I mentioned. There are some features that distinguish especially Zoroastrian fire cult from other. Zoroastrians attribute unproportionally high importance to fire. Fire in Zoroastrian rituals is never quenched, is never extinguished after the ritual being performed. This is, for example, not the case even in India, which is the closest to what we have in Iran. They extinguish the fire after yajna and have no problem. This is not what it is done in Zoroastrian in Zoroastrian rituals. So these are the main features that, and also special care is being taken of the fire, not to pollute it and to prevent it from all kinds of things. This is something also that distinguishes the particularly Zoroastrian ritual. Now, admittedly, we don't have evidence for this for the Achaemenid period, but it was certainly central for them because for the dynasty, I emphasize, because when we look on the material from a Persepolis archive, the picture is different. But when we see the official iconography, what they choose to represent is fire worship. So it was somehow central for them. But the existence of the Avestan liturgy comes from the calendar, not from, and a little bit from the names, but mainly from the existence of the calendar, which really has no other purpose than being a liturgical calendar developed, designed especially for the liturgy.
How do you explain the identification of the Yesh Tamid in the Bible with the Avestan?
I don't know much about it, and I hope to learn more from Professor Kislev's lecture this afternoon, which, as I understand, will be dedicated exactly to this subject. So I hope he will be able to answer the Yesh Tamid in the Bible.
Thank you very much. I have a question regarding the symbolism of fire. So you spoke mainly about the veneration of fire, but one of these seals somehow presented the sacrifices that were being burned in the fire. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit somehow whether this is, so to speak, one ritual or whether these are two different things, because somehow if to keep the fire burning, you don't need to put sacrifices into them. What is the symbolism in the one and in the other case?
We see animals being brought to the fire altar. They're probably slaughtered. They are not shown being burned, and this is important, although on one seal they probably are. In modern Zoroastrian practice, we still have the remain of donating a small, of feeding the fire. The terminus technicus is feeding the fire, because fire is a living being, a personification of the god in our visible world. But so they feed a small part of fat to the fire. Today, animal sacrifice went out of use, and Zoroastrianism in Iran in the 20th century, in India long before. Before that, obviously, because of the Hindu environment, but in antiquity it was very common. The very basis of Indo-Iranian sacrifice is animal sacrifice. Of course, from strictly Zoroastrian point of view, as it is defined from the Sasanian period on, you cannot burn the body of the slaughtered animal in the fire. It's the worst thing you can do because it's the pollution of the fire by the worst kind of pollution. But the Persepolis, so we see animals being brought. They are obviously slaughtered, but what is done with them is not always clear. Perhaps only the small part of fat is put in the fire. Perhaps not. We cannot exclude that in Persepolis during the Achaemenid period, there were different practices of animal sacrifice, unlike what we have today.
Well, Michael, thank you very much indeed for your presentation, which will be seminal for other researchers, and I'm sure we will have a lot of time apart to enter some problems. But I will make just 2 comments with respect to the questions, because you mentioned me.
Yes, please. It will also be useful
yeah,
for me.
Yeah, and I will make just one remark on your talk. First of all, with respect to the animal sacrifice, we have, as in the Indian tradition, various forms of rituals. So you can have a domestic ritual, then you have a domestic fire, because this also in your presentation should be inserted. So every pater familias had a fire at home, and in India, as in Iran, a good person can perform domestic rituals, in particular in a priestly family. Then you have a normal sacrifice with 2 priests. Then you have this solemn or high liturgies of various forms, even in the night, and in that case you need 8 priests. With 1 priest, the Atra Waksha, the one who increases, who grows the fire, which is the specific priest working to tend the fire and to work around the fire. In that case, you can have even animal sacrifice. And we have a special moment in the ritual in which, thanks to the comment in the corresponding text to the Brahmana of the Avesta, in which it is stated, now you have to kill the animal. Killing animals in Zoroastrianism followed special rules, so you have to kiss the animal before to kill him, you have to do things in a very special way, so avoiding suffering of the animal, and so on. And this practice continued until 1 century ago. Normally it is a little piece of the animal, of the omentum, which can be offered to the fire. But the ahoma, the corresponding beverage, the soma, the juice of a sacred plant, which is offered regularly during the liturgy, even during small liturgy. So we have to consider all these things. So probably in the Achaemenid seals, we have royal performances which can represent a normal sacrifice or even a solemn sacrifice. And it is unnecessary. Okay, yes. Well, that you offer an animal during every sacrifice. I will put comments on your talk later, and the calendar will be another conference.
Grazie mille.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, of course, I didn't mention it because it seems very obvious to me that the royal cult of fire evolved from the fire of paterfamilias. Well, it's the connection which was established long ago, for sure. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.